Hi, my name is Jake, and I am a bookish drummer. For an author like Stephen King, who has such a vast bibliography, such a huge catalog of books to choose from, many people often question whether or not a certain book is a good starting point or not, and they scour the internet and YouTube looking for the best places to start with Stephen King. Well, I am here today to show all of you wonderful people what I believe are the best places to start with Stephen King. And while I was thinking about this video and deciding which books to include on this list, there's actually quite a few good starting points for Stephen King, depending, of course, what you want out of Stephen King. Because Stephen King doesn't write the same story twice. He's always doing something different, and because of that, there's a lot of great jumping off points. Whether you want to read something scary, whether you want to read something short, whether you want to read something epic, whether you want to read something older, whether you want to read something newer, he has plenty of starting out points, and I'm going to go over all of them. Okay, enough of the preamble. Let's jump right into it. So, of course, what a lot of people do when they start reading a new author for the first time, they want to go all the way back to the beginning, their first published book. And for Stephen King, this actually isn't a terrible idea. In fact, I think it's a great idea. So if you want to do that, you want to start with Carrie, which is his very first published novel. This is about a high school girl named Carrie who is often bullied at school, but she develops this telekinesis and is able to enact revenge on the people who have wronged her. This is King's first published novel, and in my opinion, it's one of my all-time favorites by him. I would put it in my top 10. I think it's a great starting off point because, one, it's short, so the investment isn't too big. You have great character work and great character development. You have the taste of the supernatural element, and you have a great cathartic ending. So you combine all of that and you get a terrific debut novel and a great jumping off point for anyone who's new to Stephen King. These next three novels are for anyone who really wants to jump into the horror side of Stephen King. These are three of his most classic horror novels, and you can't go wrong with Misery, The Shining, and Pet Sematary. These are all super classic Stephen King horror novels. The Shining is probably the most famous, of course. It's about the Torrance family, Jack, Wendy, and their son Danny. They have to go to the Overlook Hotel because Jack has agreed to be the caretaker during a very long and heavy winter. And of course, it's one of the most famous haunted house ghost type of stories. So if you're really into that or you really want to try one of those out, this would be the perfect place to start. And for anyone who's seen the movie but they haven't read the book before, go into the book knowing that the book is going to be a little different because Stanley Kubrick changed a lot from the original source material in the movie. And it's always interesting to see which side people lie on. Do they love the book more or do they love the movie more? I personally love both, but I love the movie slightly more just because I grew up watching it and then I read this as an adult. But nevertheless, this is a fantastic starting point for any fans of horror. Pet Sematary, while this isn't necessarily a scary book, it's definitely one of the more disturbing books King has ever written. It's about this doctor named Lewis Creed and his family. They move away from the big city to move to a more small rural area. And they happen to live next to this pet cemetery where it's rumored that if your pet dies, you can go bury them in the pet cemetery and they will come back to life. So that's kind of what this book deals with. It's life and death and whether or not bringing someone back to life is necessarily a good thing or not. So like I said, it's very dark, it's very morbid, it's one of the more disturbing King books ever, and if you're into that kind of stuff, I would highly recommend this one. Also, the audiobook for this is a terrific experience. Any fans of Dexter, Michael C. Hall narrates the story, and he does a brilliant job. Misery is my second favorite Stephen King book of all time, and it's by far my favorite horror book that he's ever written. This is all about a guy named Paul Sheldon, who is a writer who's just finished the manuscript for his latest novel in the Misery series. He's driving back home in a blizzard with his manuscript in hand, and he gets into a terrible accident, and he wakes up in an unfamiliar house, and the woman that's been taking care of him is Annie Wilkes, who is his #1 fan, and she's a little cray-cray. And it's scary because he's with this crazy woman, and his legs are completely broken, so he can't move anyway, but even if he wanted to, he's stuck in the middle of Colorado during a blizzard, and he can't go anywhere anyway. And so it's a pretty terrifying reading experience. And of course, Annie Wilkes happens to be Paul Sheldon's #1 fan. She's a huge fan of the Misery novels, and what do you know it, he has the manuscript for the latest Misery novel. So she reads it, not knowing that it's supposed to be the last Misery novel, and things don't quite go well for Paul Sheldon once she realizes that. And things get a bit nasty. This is one of my favorite horror novels of all time, and it's a terrific starting point for anyone who wants to be scared shitless. These next 2 Stephen King books are for anyone who wants to jump headfirst into some of Stephen King's longer works, some of his more epic tales, and that would of course be It and The Stand. For anyone who's been living under a rock and they don't know what the story is about, it's about the entity named Pennywise the Dancing Clown, who is stalking and killing children in Derry, Maine. And it's a brick of a book. You follow 7 characters called the Losers Club, and you get perspectives from when they're children and from when they're adults. They go back and forth, and both times they have to try and kill and defeat Pennywise. And with this book, King really takes his time developing his characters, so you really get a good sense of who these people are, both as children and adults. The Stand is about a superly deadly virus called Captain Trips that ultimately kills 99.8% of the world's population. And it's about the world going through that as it's happening, and people trying to pick up the pieces, and ultimately it's the battle between good and evil. And while these behemoths aren't necessarily my favorite Stephen King books, especially The Stand I think is a little overrated, it's hard to deny that these books are beloved by most Stephen King fans. If you want a 1,000-page tome to get lost in for weeks, maybe even like a month at a time, then these 2 books are definitely the ones for you. While all of those books were horror books, maybe you're more wanting a sci-fi tale from Stephen King. And he does have a few, especially ones that involve aliens, but those aren't necessarily good starting points. I think the best true example of Stephen King writing a compelling science fiction tale would be Firestarter. Definitely less of a horror novel and definitely more of science fiction. It's about this little girl named Charlie McGee and her father, Andy McGee, and Charlie has the ability to start fires with her mind, pyrokinesis, and her dad has the ability to influence people with his mind. And there's a secret agency called the Shop that are looking to capture Charlie and potentially use her as a weapon, and they want to study her, and her father are on the run. This is also one of my all-time favorite Stephen King books that I would also put in my top 10. It's one of his best paced books, and it has one of the all-time best Stephen King endings, in my opinion. Not only is it very emotional, but it's also very cathartic. And this definitely reads like a sci-fi thriller kind of book. So if you're into sci-fi and you want to try out Stephen King, this would be a perfect place to start with that. Maybe you're someone who really enjoys short stories or novellas, and you want to try to give Stephen King's shorter fiction a shot. Well, these are probably his best places to start, in my opinion. You have Night Shift, his very first published short story collection, Different Seasons, his first novella collection, and Skeleton Crew, his second short story collection. All of these have classic Stephen King stories, short stories, and novellas. A lot of these have been turned into movies. And for my money, Stephen King is actually a superior novella writer, more so than a short story and novel writer. I really admire and appreciate the work he does with his novellas. This one includes such stories as Shawshank Redemption and The Body, aka Stand By Me. Both of these collections have wonderful stories in them. In Night Shift, some of my favorite include Children of the Corn, Quitters Inc., and I Am the Doorway. While in Skeleton Crew, some of my favorites are The Mist, The Jaunt, and Survivor Type. So if you're interested in starting to read Stephen King, but you don't want to commit to a full novel, then his shorter fiction is definitely a good place to start for you. If you're interested in reading King's more sinister and darker novels, he wrote under a pseudonym named Richard Bachman, and oftentimes the books that he wrote under Richard Bachman tend to be a bit more nihilistic in nature. So if you want to gravitate more towards those novels, some good starting points would be The Long Walk and Thinner. Oftentimes, even though Stephen King is writing in the horror genre, a lot of the times his endings can end in a somewhat hopeful nature. But when he's writing under Richard Bachman, you can pretty much assume that his endings are going to be extremely bleak. The Long Walk is essentially a dystopian tale where every year a group of 100 teenagers is gathered and they have to go on this long walk, and they can only take a certain amount of breaks, and if they exceed their numbers of stops, they are shot on sight. And basically it's a contest, and whoever is the last one standing, they get a prize of whatever they want. So a very bleak outlook in a very weird dystopian setting. Thinner is about an obese lawyer who accidentally runs over and kills the wife of a gypsy. And the gypsy, in his anger, puts a curse on this lawyer and goes, "Thinner." And so this really fat lawyer all of a sudden starts losing weight no matter how much food he eats, and he's walking around town like, "Oh, look, I'm on the diet where I can eat anything I want," until he starts getting dangerously skinny. And then what happens after that, you'll have to find out and read. So Richard Bachman is definitely a good place to start for people who want to read more darker tales from Stephen King, and these are probably the best two Richard Bachman books to start with. While King is most notably a horror writer, he's known for scaring his fans, he does have a handful of books that are considered non-horror, and some of them are actually quite good. For example, The Green Mile. This is a fantastic story that has pretty much zero horror in it. It's essentially a magical realism kind of book. This is about a prison guard in the 1930s named Paul Edgecombe and his surreal experience with an inmate named John Coffey. John Coffey is accused of murdering two little girls, and he will eventually be electrocuted and put to death. But Paul has his doubts whether or not he actually murdered these girls, and I won't get into why if you've never watched the movie or if you haven't read the book. And this book just has amazing character work, and it's one of the best things he's ever written, despite it straying away from the horror genre completely. So if you want to jump into reading Stephen King books, but you're a bit of a scaredy cat, then this book will not scare you at all. It might make you cry, though. For a lot of Stephen King books, they can be a bit of a sausage party, meaning that a lot of his main characters are male. But he does have a few terrific books to start with if you're looking for more of a female-centric book, books that have female protagonists that are extremely well written. Some of his best female protagonists can be found in these three books, and that would be Gerald's Game, Dolores Claiborne, and Rose Madder. Gerald's Game is written from the perspective of a middle-aged woman named Jessie. She's on vacation with her husband, and her husband likes to play this game where she gets handcuffed to the bed before they start having sex. And she kind of reluctantly agrees to do it, and eventually he starts acting really weird, and she does not want this to happen. And something happens where the husband dies, and he is dead on the floor, and she's stuck on the bed, handcuffed to the bed, and she can't move or get out. And the rest of the novel is her trying to figure out how is she going to get out of the situation, and her trying to deal with the trauma of her dead husband lying on the floor and reliving her past trauma. And this book was just very well written, and the female character of Jessie is one of the best protagonists he's ever written. And the same thing can be said about this other book, Dolores Claiborne. Dolores Claiborne is a fantastic female protagonist written by King. And this book is all about her life, her backstory, and she's being interrogated by the police because she's suspected of murdering someone. And she's basically explaining her backstory, and it's just incredibly well written. This next book is not one of my favorite Stephen King books. I actually don't like the second half of this book, but for Rose Madder, the main character, Rose, is incredibly well written, and she's a fantastic female character, and I completely understand why people love this book. Most people don't, but for the people who do, I understand why. The story is about Rose, who's in an abusive relationship with her husband, and she decides to leave town. She goes to New York to try to find a better life, and her abusive husband tries to find her, and it starts out very well. Like, the first 200 pages are extremely well written, and the protagonist is great. My issue is in the second half, he starts to add in and shoehorn in this supernatural element, and the second half is just dumb. But it's still worth reading if you want to have a compelling female protagonist as your lead. So if you're looking for good examples of Stephen King writing female protagonists, then these are 3 excellent places to start. If you're looking for a Stephen King book that you don't already know the general premise or the plot to, because a lot of his older books have movie adaptations and a bunch of people have already seen those, some of his newer books, some of the books that have come out in the past 10 or 15 years, jumping into those can actually feel very refreshing since you already don't know what's going to happen in them. A book that came out in 2008 that I would easily put in my top 10 Stephen King books of all time would be Doomakey. Most Stephen King books take place in colder, dreary environments like Maine or Colorado, but this book is especially unique because it takes place in Florida. While this is stereotypical King writing in the sense that there's great character work and there's great supernatural elements, it's also just a change of scenery for Stephen King. He's used to writing in much colder and dreary environments. And more importantly, there's not an adaptation to base this off of, so you can really jump headfirst into this book and experience a completely new story. Whereas sometimes, like myself, I grew up watching Stephen King movies like Cujo, The Shining, It. So when I read those books, I wasn't really shocked by anything that went down in those books. But the first time I read this book, it was completely fresh to me, and I loved every minute of it. Same thing with this next book, which came out in 2014, and that would be Revival. At this point, this film has no adaptation, so you can jump into this book and have zero clue about what it's going to be about and what roads it will go down. I don't like to say too much about this book when recommending to it because it's told in a very unique way where you basically tell the entire life story of one man. It starts when he's very little, and chapter by chapter you see him grow up, and just the stuff that happens in his life is just very interesting to read about, and you don't often get a King book written in that manner. Normally King books are written in a much shorter range of time, but this one spans, like I said, an entire man's life. I will say this book deals a lot with life and death and religion and the afterlife And if any of that sounds interesting to you and you're really into having dark and sinister endings to a book, I would recommend this book highly. The last book I have to recommend to y'all today is a book that came out in 2010, and it's a very dark and sinister novella collection, and that would of course be Full Dark, No Stars. And the title is very fitting, Full Dark, No Stars. All of these novellas are very dark and sinister in their own ways. You have a father and a son who agree to kill the mother and the repercussions of that. You have a rape revenge tale. You have a dark and sinister black comedy. And you have a woman who slowly realizes that the husband she's been married to for years is a serial killer. This book is no warm ray of sunshine. So yes, if you want to read more of a modern take on what Stephen King considers to be dark and gruesome, I would highly recommend this novella collection, Full Dark, No Stars. Alright, so those are all of the Stephen King books that I would consider to be good starting points for starting your Stephen King journey. If you are new to Stephen King, let me know down in the comments below what book you are going to start your Stephen King journey with. And for any longtime constant readers, please let me know what your first Stephen King book was, the first book that initially hooked you into reading more Stephen King. Let me know all of that down in the comments below. And tomorrow I will have the exact opposite of this video, the absolute worst places to start with Stephen King. Look for that tomorrow. And as always, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for watching and have a terrific day. What the fuck am I doing?